Hey everybody, welcome back to our Luke deep dive. We are continuing in Luke chapter 9, and this time reading through verses 10 to 17. This is one of the most famous gospel stories of Jesus feeding the 5,000 men. This is one of the very few accounts that are in all four gospels. We must remember that John is doing his own thing and telling his own stories. And so it's really important to note when John's stories matches with other stories in Matthew, Mark, and Luke. And this is one of those ones where this account is present in John as well, which means that to every early church community, this was one of the most foundational stories about Jesus that they wanted to communicate to their audiences. But why? This is a kind of interesting and strange story to recall. In Luke's context, you may remember that immediately prior to this, Jesus sends out his disciples to go and preach the good news and to heal and cure diseases and drive out demons. And they do that, and they come back, and here they report back to him what they had done. They had taken this initiative to be gospel proclaimers themselves, and it seemed like they were successful. And so he then attempts to take them and withdraw them to a private place where they can rest and recover as is appropriate after you've done major ministry work. But there were a bunch of crowds of people who had seen them, recognized them, had known what Jesus and these disciples had been up to, and they follow Jesus out into the countryside. And Jesus preaches the good news to them, he heals them, but then it gets late. The disciples notice it's late, and they say, Jesus, you need to send these people home. It's dinner time. They're going to get grumpy, and there's nothing to eat out here. Jesus has this really interesting response. He says to them, you give them something to eat. I can imagine what the disciples must have been feeling like at that stage, that they kind of look around and like, wait a second, they're counting everybody, 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, and they just keep counting, and they realize this is a massive crowd of people, right? And they start looking around, and they're like, we don't have very much. How is this even possible? The other gospel accounts kind of fill in more of this story. John tells us that a boy comes up in the crowd and offers his loaves of bread and his fish, and that gets distributed. The other gospels mention how that the disciples kind of had this discussion. They say, like, even if we had 200 denarii, which is a lot of money, right? That even if we had that much money, we still wouldn't be able to feed enough people or to afford enough food to buy for everyone. This is crazy. In Luke's gospel, they just simply answer, but we only have 5 loaves of bread and 2 fish, unless we try and go and buy food for all this crowd, because there's 5,000 people here, Jesus. So what's Jesus doing here, and why is this important? Well, again, it's important for us to draw our attention to what just happened prior to this in context. Jesus sends out his disciples without him to go proclaim the good news everywhere with his power. He says, take nothing with you. Don't take, a bag. Don't take a shirt. Don't take a staff. Don't take a cloak. Don't take anything with you. You are meant to represent me and depend on me as you go and proclaim the good news. And this is what they did, and they did it successfully. But now they've come back here, and they're with Jesus again, and Jesus is giving them another task. The same sort of task of saying, go and do something on behalf of me with my power, but the disciples, again, don't get it. They make the same mistake. They're like, what are you talking about? There's no way we can afford that much food for everybody. And what Jesus is doing here, and this connects with what immediately follows in this context, this is why context is very important, is that Jesus is preparing his disciples for life without him around. That gets talked about in the very next section, so I won't jump ahead. But essentially, Jesus is trying to impart this idea into his followers that they are called to do what Jesus does. They are to proclaim the good news. They are to release the prisoners who have been captive. They are the ones who are to bring healing to the sick. They're the ones that are to feed the hungry, right? And they do this for him, representing him, but also, and this is important here, depending and relying on him to be able to do these things. Jesus doesn't ask the disciples to feed these people from their own strength or their own ingenuity, right? This is the disciples' question. How are we going to afford all this food? How are we going to buy all this stuff? Where are we going to find food for all this? They're thinking in terms of Jesus has given them the task, and it's their job independently, without him, to figure out how they're going to do this task. But that's not what Jesus is trying to communicate to them here. He has given them a task. You are to feed these people, just like I. This is what I do. This is what God's kingdom is like. I want you to follow after me. But then he also wants them to depend on his strength, his power, his infinite resources to be able to do the work that he's given them rather than them do it themselves. This is what happens. So Jesus, he gets brought these 5 loaves of bread, these 2 fish, which are 7. 7 is a significant biblical number, the number of perfection, just so you know. And he tells the disciples, he gives them instructions of what they are to do. Tell them to sit down in groups of 50. So the disciples do that. And then Jesus takes the loaves and the fish, he breaks them, he gives thanks, he blesses them. And then what does he do? Does Jesus give it out? No. He gives it to the disciples to give out. So they're the ones doing something. Now, the interesting thing about this passage is it never tells us how this bread and this fish get multiplied to feed 5,000 men. There's probably even more people in the crowd than just 5,000, but they're just counting the men here. So is it that they just divided everything, like cut up into like microscopic pieces, and then they gave those each out to everybody, and then they ate it, and all of a sudden, like, oh, I feel full? Probably not, because there was leftovers afterward. My guess, this is just a guess, is that as they're handing out, they have like a serving tray or something. They're like 1 piece of bread, 1 fish for you, and then they look and there's the bread and the fish are still there again. They're like, okay, 1 bread and 1 fish, now I'm done. I've given all, wait, there's food here again. And so somehow they are involved in this multiplication process. That's the whole point. And Luke doesn't want to tell us exactly how it worked out, other than it happened. Everybody ate and were satisfied, and 12 basketfuls got picked up as leftovers. This 12 connects back to the Old Testament in the 12 tribes of Israel. We have 12 disciples. We have a woman bleeding for 12 years, a girl who had been 12 years old. Now there's 12 basketfuls here. This is all indicative of Jesus connecting his story to the past of what God has done and how he's provided for his people, and moving into the future of what God is now doing, not just for his own people, Israel, but for the whole world. And so that's where this is significant. I really like how biblical scholar Darrell Bach concludes this section. He says, Luke 9:10-17 is a major lesson for the disciples. Jesus is the one who can meet needs, and the disciples are called to serve as his ministers in meeting those needs. How will they do it? What the disciples do not do is ask Jesus to provide. They need to realize that for them to minister, they need to rely on Jesus. This is the first of many accounts where the disciples' instinctive reaction are wrong. And the practical application for us is that Jesus is calling us to do the same. That Jesus calls us, he invites us to be his friends, his followers, his family, and he's making us new, but he also wants to help use us to carry on his kingdom mission to transform this world so that everyone might know the good news about Jesus. But he doesn't do that to say, okay, go and tell the world about me, go and feed the hungry, go and do all these things, but do it on your own power and your own strength and your own ingenuity, but rather to do this with his power, with his authority, with his resources. And so the question is, What has God laid on your heart or challenged you to do that you keep depending on your own strength for rather than God's? And how might we go about with this change of our attitude to say, like, okay, God, you've given me this responsibility or this task to model myself after you, to proclaim your kingdom, but how can I, instead of relying on myself and thinking it's all up to me, to trust in you, that you are going to provide, you're going to see this thing through, and you are the one that's going to be doing the work through me? What can you do this week for God's kingdom that relies on Jesus' strength rather than your own? With that, we'll see you next time. Bye.